The drums had already started, and Elena could feel her own heartbeat trying to match their rhythm, faster and faster, like it wanted to escape her chest before she did something foolish. Around her, hundreds of wolves stood in the torchlit courtyard, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark, waiting for the mating ceremony to begin. She was not waiting. She was calculating. She had exactly a few minutes before the binding ritual started, and if she did not act now, Draven would claim her, and there would be nothing she could do to stop it. She pushed through the crowd, her heart pounding so loud she thought the wolves closest to her could hear it. She had heard the whispers all week. Draven, the pack's most feared beta, had told his men that tonight, no matter what the bond decided, Elena would belong to him. He did not care about fate. He cared about power, and claiming a woman everyone knew he wanted would only add to his reputation. The elders would look away, as they always did when it came to men like him. Nobody would stop him. Nobody ever did. Elena had spent the last 3 nights awake, staring at the ceiling of her small room, trying to think of a way out. She had thought about running, but the borders of the packlands were guarded, and a lone woman running into the forest during a mating ceremony would only draw suspicion, and worse, would mark her as an outcast forever. She had thought about begging the elders for protection, but she was a low-ranking pack member, and her voice carried no weight in rooms full of powerful men. She had thought about pretending to be sick, but Draven had eyes everywhere, and he would only wait for the next ceremony, and the next, until he got what he wanted. Then, 2 nights ago, walking home from the kitchens where she worked, she had seen him, a stranger, sitting alone near the edge of the courtyard, wrapped in a torn cloak, his hood pulled low over his face. Nobody spoke to him. Nobody even looked at him. The guards had let him stay because he seemed harmless, just another wanderer who had drifted into pack territory, looking for scraps of food and a warm place to sleep. Elena had walked past him twice that week, and both times, something about him had caught her attention, though she could not explain what. He never asked for anything. He never begged, despite what everyone assumed about him. He simply sat, watching the world pass by with a quiet, unreadable calm. An idea had formed in her mind that night, wild and desperate, but the only one she had. If she did something scandalous enough, something so far beneath her supposed dignity that even Draven would not want to touch her afterward, maybe he would let her go. Maybe the elders would look at her with disgust instead of pity, and Draven's pride would not allow him to claim a woman who had humiliated herself in front of the entire pack. It was a terrible plan. It was also the only one she had. Now, standing at the edge of the crowd, watching the fires burn higher as the elders began their chant, Elena searched the courtyard until she found him. The stranger sat exactly where he always did, apart from the others, his hood shadowing most of his face. She took a breath, forced her legs to move, and walked toward him, before her fear could catch up with her courage. The crowd noticed her leaving her place near the center, where the unmated wolves were supposed to stand, but nobody said anything yet. She reached the stranger, just as the elders raised their arms to begin the binding words, the moment when the mate bond, if it existed between any 2 wolves present, would ignite and mark them forever. She had only seconds. She knelt down in front of him, and for the first time, he lifted his head slightly, enough that she could see a sliver of his jaw, sharp and unreadable in the torchlight. She did not let herself hesitate. She leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The courtyard went silent. Even the drums seemed to stop, as if the whole world had paused to witness what she had done. She had expected shock. She had expected him to pull back, confused, maybe even offended. What she had not expected was the warmth. The moment their lips touched, something ignited beneath her skin, a heat that spread from her chest outward, curling through her arms and down her spine, settling low in her stomach like a fire finding new wood. It was not the disgust she had planned for. It was not rejection. It was the mate bond, unmistakable, undeniable, and completely, terrifyingly real. She pulled back, her eyes wide, her breath coming in short gasps. The stranger had gone rigid beneath her touch, his hands frozen where they rested on his knees, and for one long moment, he did not move at all. Then, slowly, he lifted his head fully, and the hood slipped back just enough to reveal a pair of eyes that glowed gold in the firelight, far too bright, far too commanding, for a man everyone had dismissed as a beggar. Elena scrambled backward, her mind racing to catch up with what her body had just confirmed. This was not supposed to happen. This was supposed to be a scandal, a disgrace, something that would make Draven turn away in revulsion. Instead, she had just bound herself, in front of the entire pack, to a man whose identity she did not even know. The silence in the courtyard stretched unbearably long. Then, one by one she heard it, a sound she had never expected to hear directed at the ragged stranger she had just kissed. The guards nearest to him were kneeling, not bowing their heads in respect, but kneeling fully, their fists pressed to the ground, their eyes lowered in a gesture reserved for only one kind of person in all the Packlands. Elena's stomach dropped. She looked around at the crowd, searching for some explanation, some sign that she was imagining things. But everywhere she looked, wolves were staring at the stranger, with expressions of shock and, increasingly, recognition. Whispers began to ripple outward from the front of the crowd, spreading like wildfire through dry grass, and she caught fragments of words that made her blood run cold. He said his name softly. He rose to his feet, and even in the torn cloak, even with his hood still shadowing half his face, there was something in the way he moved that commanded the space around him, an authority that had nothing to do with clothing or appearance, and everything to do with something deeper, something that made even the fire seem to bend toward him. Draven pushed through the crowd, his face contorted with fury and disbelief, but even he stopped several paces away, his mouth opening and closing as he tried to find words. The elders at the front of the ceremony had gone pale, their chanting completely forgotten, and one of them, an old woman with silver hair and trembling hands, stepped forward and lowered herself into the same kneeling position as the guards. Elena still knelt on the ground, where she had fallen back, too stunned to move, watching as the man she had kissed to escape one fate walked directly into the center of the courtyard, where the light of the largest fire illuminated him fully for the first time. His cloak fell open slightly as he moved, revealing not the rags of a beggar, but fine, dark fabric beneath, the kind worn only by nobility, hidden away under layers of disguise. He stopped in the center of the courtyard and slowly reached up, pulling his hood back completely. The torchlight caught his face fully now, sharp features, dark hair, and those unmistakable golden eyes that Elena realized, with a jolt of horror, she had seen before, not in person, but in the portraits that hung in the great hall, portraits she had walked past 100 times without truly looking at them, portraits of the Alpha King. She had not kissed a beggar. She had kissed the most powerful wolf in the entire kingdom, the ruler whose word could end lives with a single command, the man whose court every pack in the region answered to. And now, because of the mate bond that had just ignited between them in front of hundreds of witnesses, she was bound to him, irreversibly, for the rest of her life. The crowd erupted into whispers and murmurs, a wave of sound that grew louder with every passing second. Draven stood frozen, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles had turned white, his eyes darting between Elena and the man he had never suspected was anything more than a wandering stranger. Elena could see the calculations happening behind his eyes, the desperate scramble to understand how his plan to claim her had been destroyed so completely, and by something even he could not have anticipated. The Alpha King, whose name Elena now knew was Kale, though she had heard it only in fragments of terrified whispers around her, turned his gaze toward her. She still knelt on the ground, unable to make her legs work, unable to process what had just happened. His expression was not what she expected. There was no anger in his eyes, no fury at being kissed by a stranger in the middle of a ceremony he had clearly attended in disguise for reasons of his own. Instead, there was something else, something careful and calculating, as if he were reassembling an entire plan in real time, adjusting to a variable he had never accounted for. He walked toward her, and the crowd parted instinctively, creating a path between them. Elena forced herself to rise to her feet, though her legs trembled beneath her, and she stood facing him, close enough now to see the faint lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the kind that came from carrying a weight far heavier than most people ever had to bear. He did not speak immediately. He studied her for a long moment, his golden eyes moving over her face, as if trying to read something written there, something only he could see. Elena felt her pulse quicken again, not from fear this time, but from something else entirely, something she did not have a name for yet. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady, carrying easily across the silent courtyard despite its softness. He said that what had happened tonight had not been planned by either of them. but that it could not be undone. The bond, once formed, could not be broken by wishing it away. Elena's mouth went dry. She wanted to explain, to tell him that she had never intended to bind herself to anyone, that her plan had only ever been to escape a man who intended to claim her against her will, but the words caught in her throat. How could she explain such a thing here, in front of everyone, without revealing Draven's intentions, and risking his fury turning toward her even more violently than before? Cale seemed to sense her hesitation, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of understanding that surprised her. He turned his head slightly, his gaze passing over Draven, who still stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, and something dark passed behind his golden eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared. He extended a hand toward her, not in a gesture of romance or affection, but simply as an offer, a way to help her rise fully and steady herself. Elena hesitated only a moment before taking it, and the warmth she had felt during the kiss returned instantly, spreading up her arm and settling into her chest, a constant hum beneath her skin that she suspected would never fully fade now that the bond had formed. The elders, still kneeling, began to murmur among themselves, and Elena caught fragments of their conversation, words like fate and destiny and the old prophecies, though she could not follow the full meaning. She only knew that whatever had happened tonight was far bigger than a simple mistake made in desperation. It was something the entire pack, and likely every pack under Cale's rule, would be discussing for years to come. Cale turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had made the guards kneel the moment they recognized him. He announced that the ceremony would conclude as planned, but that further matters would be addressed privately. His tone left no room for argument, and the elders, though clearly still processing the shock of the evening, began ushering the crowd back into the ceremony's remaining rituals, though the energy in the courtyard had shifted entirely. Nobody was paying attention to the other unmated wolves anymore. Every eye kept drifting back toward Elena and the king standing beside her. Elena felt a hand grip her wrist, not gently, and turned to find Draven glaring at her, his voice low and venomous as he leaned close enough that only she could hear him. He told her that she had made a grave mistake, that whatever she thought she had escaped tonight, she would soon wish she had simply accepted her fate with him instead. Elena's blood ran cold, but before she could respond, Cale's hand closed around Draven's wrist, pulling it away from her with a strength that made Draven wince despite his attempt to hide it. Cale's voice, when he spoke to Draven, was quiet, but carried a weight that made the surrounding wolves take an involuntary step back. He told Draven that whatever business existed between him and Elena was concluded, effective immediately, and that any further attempt to threaten her would be treated as a direct challenge to the crown. Draven's face paled, and he released his grip entirely, stepping back into the crowd without another word, though the hatred in his eyes remained plain for anyone who cared to look. Elena watched him disappear into the shifting crowd, her heart still racing, though for entirely different reasons now. She turned back to Cale, who was watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher, somewhere between curiosity and something more guarded, more careful. He told her, quietly enough that only she could hear, that they would speak more once the ceremony concluded, and that she should remain nearby until then. Elena nodded, though her mind was still spinning, trying to process everything that had happened in the span of only a few minutes. She had come to this ceremony with a desperate plan to avoid one fate, only to find herself bound instead to a man whose power and position she could barely comprehend. As the ceremony resumed around them, the drums picking up their rhythm once more, Elena stood beside Cale, feeling the eyes of the entire pack on her, feeling the warmth of the bond humming steadily beneath her skin, and wondering, with a mixture of fear and something she refused to name just yet, what exactly her impulsive decision had set into motion. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. Other unmated wolves stepped forward as their names were called, some finding their bonds ignite with partners chosen by fate, others walking away unmatched, destined to try again at the next ceremony. Elena barely registered any of it, her attention fixed on the man standing silently beside her, whose presence alone seemed to draw the attention of every wolf in the courtyard, whispers following him like a shadow he had clearly hoped to leave behind when he first arrived in disguise. She stole glances at him throughout the remainder of the ceremony, trying to understand how she had failed to recognize him earlier. Now that she knew the truth, the resemblance to the portraits in the Great Hall seemed obvious. The sharp jaw, the commanding posture, even when seated among strangers, the way his eyes seemed to see far more than he let on. She wondered how long he had been sitting in that courtyard, disguised as nothing more than a wanderer, watching the pack go about its business without the deference his title would normally demand. When the ceremony finally concluded and the crowd began to disperse, still buzzing with whispered speculation about what they had witnessed, Cale turned to Elena and gestured for her to follow him. She fell into step beside him, acutely aware of the stares that followed them as they made their way toward the largest building at the edge of the courtyard, a structure she had always known belonged to visiting dignitaries, but had never once entered. Inside, the noise of the crowd faded, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against Elena's ears. Cale led her into a small sitting room, dimly lit by a single lantern, and gestured for her to sit. She lowered herself onto a wooden chair, her hands twisting together in her lap, while Cale remained standing, his back to her for a long moment, as he seemed to gather his thoughts. When he finally turned to face her, his expression had shifted again, the careful authority, replaced by something more tired, more human. He asked her, plainly, why she had done it. Not with anger, but with genuine curiosity, as if he truly wanted to understand what had driven a stranger to kiss him in the middle of a ceremony meant for finding fated partners. Elena hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, but something in his eyes told her that lying would serve no purpose, and might even make things worse. She took a breath and told him the truth, that she had noticed him sitting alone for days, assumed he was simply a wanderer passing through, and had chosen him, specifically, because she believed kissing someone so far beneath her supposed standing would disgrace her enough to make Draven abandon his plans to claim her. She watched his face carefully as she spoke, bracing herself for anger or offense at being called beneath anyone's standing, but instead, something almost like amusement flickered across his features, quickly suppressed. He told her that her plan, while creative, had produced an outcome neither of them could have anticipated, and that they now had to figure out how to move forward from a situation neither of them had chosen. Elena's chest tightened at his words. She wanted to ask what that meant, whether he intended to send her away, to have the bond somehow broken, or to simply ignore what had happened and continue with his life, as though the ceremony had never occurred. But before she could voice any of these questions, Cale moved to a chair across from her and sat down, his posture more relaxed now, though his eyes remained sharp and watchful. He explained, carefully, that he had come to the ceremony in disguise, for reasons that had nothing to do with finding a mate. He told her that his court had become dangerous in recent months, that he suspected someone close to him of plotting against his rule, and that he had wanted to observe the pack without the weight of his title influencing what he saw and heard. He had not expected, in any scenario he had imagined, to leave the ceremony bound to anyone. Elena listened, her fear slowly giving way to a cautious curiosity of her own. She asked him, tentatively, what he intended to do now that the bond had formed. Cale was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself to hold his gaze. He told her that the bond could not be undone, that even if they both wished it away, it would remain, a permanent connection neither of them could escape. But he also told her that she had a choice in how she wanted to proceed. She could leave the palace grounds entirely, return to her life in the pack, and they would never need to speak of this again, beyond what was necessary to satisfy the elder's curiosity. Or she could stay, learn what it meant to be bound to him, and become entangled in the dangers currently surrounding his throne. Dangers he admitted he did not yet fully understand himself. Elena's mind raced. Leaving seemed like the safer choice, the simpler path back to the life she had known, even if that life included the constant fear of Draven's schemes. But something about the way Cale spoke, the honesty in his voice despite his position of power, made her hesitate. She thought about the warmth still humming beneath her skin, the bond that connected them now whether she wanted it or not, and wondered what it would mean to walk away from something so fundamentally tied to who she was, at least from this point forward. She asked him for time to think, and he agreed without hesitation, telling her that she could remain in the palace grounds for as long as she needed to make her decision, and that no harm would come to her, regardless of what she chose. Elena thanked him quietly, though her mind was already spinning with the weight of the choice in front of her, a choice that had begun as a desperate attempt to escape one fate, and had somehow led her to the doorstep of an entirely different, far more complicated one. As she rose to leave the sitting room, escorted by a quiet attendant who had appeared at the door. She glanced back once at Cale, still seated in his chair, watching her with an expression she could not fully read. Whatever happened next, she knew her life had changed irreversibly the moment her lips had touched his, and there was no plan, no matter how desperate or clever, that could undo what fate, or perhaps something far more deliberate, had set into motion that night. The attendant led her down a quiet corridor, lined with tall windows, moonlight spilling across the polished floor, in long silver strips. Elena walked in silence, her thoughts a tangled mess of fear, confusion, and something else she was not yet ready to name. She kept replaying the moment in the courtyard, the warmth that had spread through her the instant their lips touched, the way the entire world had seemed to hold its breath around them. She was given a small room near the edge of the palace grounds, simple but comfortable, far removed from the grandeur she had expected of a king's residence. She wondered if that was intentional, a quiet acknowledgement that she was not yet part of his world, not truly, despite the bond that now tied them together. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after the attendant left, staring at her hands, trying to steady her breathing. Outside her window, she could still hear faint echoes of the ceremony's aftermath, the murmur of pack members discussing what they had witnessed, their voices carrying on the night air. She caught fragments of conversation drifting up from the courtyard below, people speculating about what her sudden bond to the king might mean for the pack, for the region, for the political balance that had existed for generations. She realized, with a growing sense of unease, that her impulsive decision had implications far beyond her own life, implications she was only beginning to understand. She thought about Draven, about the fury in his eyes when Cale had pulled his hand away from her wrist, about the threat he had whispered before disappearing into the crowd. She did not know what he might do now that his plans had been so thoroughly disrupted, but she suspected this was not the end of his interest in her, regardless of the bond that now protected her from his original intentions. She thought too about Cale himself, about the tired honesty in his eyes when he had explained why he had come to the ceremony in disguise, about the danger he suspected surrounded his own throne. She wondered what kind of man ruled an entire kingdom, yet felt the need to hide his identity, just to observe his own people, without their fear or reverence coloring what he saw. There was something about that admission that struck her as unexpectedly vulnerable, a crack in the armor of a king she had assumed, like most people, was untouchable. As the night wore on and the sounds outside gradually faded, Elena lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, the warmth of the bond still humming faintly beneath her skin, a constant reminder that her life had changed in ways she could not yet fully grasp. She did not know what she would decide when Cale asked for her answer, whether she would return to the familiar dangers of her old life or step forward into the unknown dangers of a new one. But as sleep finally began to pull at the edges of her mind, one thought remained clear above all the confusion and fear. Whatever happened next, there would be no going back to the woman she had been before she knelt in front of a stranger and pressed her lips to his, in a desperate bid for freedom. That woman was gone, and in her place stood someone bound, irreversibly, to the fate of a kingdom she had never asked to be part of. The morning light woke her earlier than she expected, and for a moment, lying in the unfamiliar room, she almost convinced herself that the previous night had been nothing more than an elaborate dream. But the warmth beneath her skin remained, steady and undeniable, and when she rose to look out the window, she saw guards moving through the courtyard below, with a new alertness, a heightened awareness that had not existed before the ceremony. She dressed quickly, unsure what the day would bring, and had barely finished when a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find the same attendant from the previous night, who informed her that the king wished to speak with her again, and that breakfast had been prepared for them both, in a private chamber overlooking the eastern gardens. Elena followed the attendant through the quiet corridors, her mind still racing with unanswered questions, and when she was finally led into the chamber where Cale waited, she found him already seated, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp with the same watchfulness she had noticed the night before. He gestured for her to join him, and as she sat, she realized that whatever answer she gave him today would shape not only her own future, but potentially the fate of everyone connected to the throne he occupied. The gardens outside the window were still, the early morning mist clinging to the grass, and somewhere beyond the palace walls, she knew the pack was already buzzing with speculation about what had happened, and what might happen next. Elena took a slow breath, steadying herself, and looked across the table at the man whose fate had become tangled with her own the moment she had made her desperate, impulsive choice. Whatever came next, she realized, she would have to face it with her eyes open, fully aware of the world she was stepping into, a world of power, danger, and a bond she could no longer pretend did not exist. Elena barely touched her food, her fingers wrapped tightly around the warm cup in front of her, though she made no move to drink from it. Across the table, Kale ate slowly, deliberately, as though he had all the time in the world, though she suspected that was far from true. The silence between them stretched long enough that she finally forced herself to speak, asking him plainly what would happen to her if she chose to leave the palace grounds and return to her old life. Kale set down his cup and studied her for a moment before answering. He told her that the bond, once formed, meant she would always feel a pull toward him, a quiet awareness of his presence no matter the distance between them, and that this feeling would never fully fade regardless of the choice she made. He said that if she chose to leave, he would not stop her, and he would ensure Draven never bothered her again, using whatever authority necessary to guarantee her safety. But he also admitted, with a rare flicker of vulnerability in his golden eyes, that leaving would not undo what had already happened between them, only delay whatever the bond eventually demanded of them both. Elena considered his words carefully. She had come from a life of quiet survival, working long hours in the kitchens, avoiding the attention of powerful men, keeping her head down so as not to draw notice. The idea of stepping into a world of politics, danger, and a king's court terrified her in ways she could barely articulate. And yet, some part of her, the same part that had knelt before a stranger in a desperate act of defiance, felt a pull toward staying, toward understanding what this bond truly meant, and toward the man sitting across from her, who had shown her more honesty in one evening than most people in her life ever had. She asked him about the danger he had mentioned the night before, the plot he suspected within his own court. Kale's expression grew more guarded, though he did not refuse to answer. He explained that his father, the previous Alpha King, had died under circumstances that had never been fully explained, officially recorded as a hunting accident, though Kale had long suspected foul play. Since taking the throne, he had noticed small inconsistencies within his council, decisions that seemed designed to weaken certain alliances, resources that vanished without adequate explanation, and whispers among the guards of meetings held in secret, away from his knowledge. He told her that he had begun disguising himself and moving among the packs, specifically to gather information, without the filter of formality and fear that came with his title, hoping to catch some thread that might lead him to the truth. He had not expected the mating ceremony to become the site of anything beyond another night of quiet observation. Elena's actions had changed that entirely, though he admitted, with the faintest hint of something that might have been gratitude, that the bond formed between them might prove useful in ways neither of them had anticipated. Elena frowned, unsure what he meant, and Kale explained further. A mate bond, once confirmed publicly, was recognized throughout every pack under his rule as sacred and unbreakable, a connection that could not be forged through political maneuvering or manipulation. If someone within his court was indeed plotting against him, they would not have anticipated a bond forming so suddenly, so publicly, and so far outside their control. It meant, whether she realized it or not, that Elena had inadvertently become someone whose loyalty could not easily be questioned or manipulated by the same forces working against him. The weight of his words settled heavily on Elena's shoulders. She had never imagined herself as someone capable of playing any role in matters of court intrigue, let alone one so central to the safety of a king. She asked him, her voice quieter now, whether he believed she could actually be helpful in uncovering whatever plot threatened his throne, or whether he simply saw her as a convenient shield against suspicion. Kale was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she held his gaze. He told her, finally, that he did not yet know the answer to that question himself, but that he had learned, through years of navigating a dangerous court, to trust his instincts, and his instincts told him that the woman who had knelt before a disguised stranger to avoid a fate she found unbearable was not someone who would shy away from difficult choices when they mattered most. His words settled something in Elena's chest, a quiet resolve beginning to form beneath the fear and uncertainty that had consumed her since the previous night. She thought about her life in the pack, the years spent trying to remain invisible, trying to avoid the notice of men like Draven who saw women like her as objects to be claimed, rather than people with their own will and choices. She thought about the warmth of the bond still humming beneath her skin, undeniable proof that fate, or perhaps something else entirely, had chosen this path for her, regardless of her original intentions. She told him, her voice steadier than she expected, that she would stay. Not because she fully understood what staying would mean, or because she was certain she could help him uncover whatever conspiracy threatened his rule, but because she found herself unwilling to walk away from a truth she could not deny, no matter how frightening it felt to acknowledge it. The bond existed, it was real, and running from it, she suspected, would only lead to a lifetime of wondering what she had left behind. Cale's expression shifted at her words, something like relief flickering briefly across his features before his careful composure returned. He told her that her decision would not be without difficulty, that life within his court came with dangers she could not yet fully comprehend, and that she would need to learn quickly how to navigate the political currents that ran beneath every conversation, every alliance, every seemingly casual interaction among the nobility. But he also promised her, with a sincerity that surprised her, that he would do everything in his power to keep her safe, and that she would not face these dangers alone. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock at the door, and an older man entered the chamber, his expression tight with concern. Elena recognized him from the ceremony the night before, as one of the elders who had knelt so suddenly when Cale's identity had been revealed. He introduced himself as Corwin, a senior member of the King's Council, and requested a private word with Cale regarding urgent matters that had arisen overnight. Cale excused himself, telling Elena that an attendant would show her to a more permanent chamber within the palace, one better suited to her new position, and that they would speak further once his business with the council had concluded. Elena watched him leave the room with Corwin, noting the tension in Cale's shoulders that had not been present during their conversation, and wondered what urgent matters could have arisen so quickly after the events of the previous night. The attendant who arrived to guide her through the palace was a young woman named Wren, whose warm smile and easy manner immediately put Elena at ease, at least somewhat. As they walked through the winding corridors, Wren chattered lightly about the palace grounds, pointing out various rooms and explaining their purposes, though Elena noticed the way Wren occasionally glanced at her, with poorly concealed curiosity, clearly eager to learn more about the woman who had bonded with the Alpha King in such an unexpected fashion. Elena's new chamber was far grander than the room she had slept in the previous night, with tall windows overlooking the palace gardens and furnishings that spoke of a wealth she had never experienced in her life. She stood in the center of the room for a long moment after Wren left her alone, trying to reconcile the life she had known just 2 days ago with the strange new reality unfolding around her. She spent the rest of the morning exploring the chamber and the small adjoining sitting room, trying to distract herself from the whirlwind of thoughts still spinning through her mind. She thought about her mother, long since passed, and wondered what she would have thought of her daughter's sudden and unexpected rise from kitchen worker to the maid of a king. She thought about the other pack members she had left behind, the friends she had made over the years, and wondered how they were reacting to the news that had surely spread through every corner of the Packlands by now. By midday, Wren returned to inform her that Cale had requested her presence in the council chamber, where a meeting had been called to formally address the political implications of the previous night's events. Elena's stomach tightened with nerves as she followed Wren through the palace, bracing herself for whatever awaited her among the king's advisors and council members. The council chamber was a large room dominated by a long table, around which sat several men and women whose expressions ranged from curious to openly skeptical as Elena entered. Cale sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid and formal, a stark contrast to the more relaxed demeanor he had shown during their breakfast conversation. He gestured for her to take the seat beside him, and Elena did so, acutely aware of the many eyes tracking her every movement. Corwin, seated near Cale's other side, began the meeting by addressing the council directly, explaining that the bond formed the previous night between the king and Elena had significant implications for the stability of the throne, particularly given the recent tensions within the region. He spoke carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a man accustomed to navigating delicate political situations, though Elena caught an undertone in his voice that suggested he was not entirely pleased with the turn of events. Other council members voiced their own concerns, some questioning Elena's suitability given her low standing within her original pack, others expressing worry about how neighboring territories might react to news of the bond, and still others raising questions about the timing, given the ongoing investigation into potential threats against the crown. Elena listened to each concern with growing unease, feeling increasingly like a problem to be solved rather than a person with her own thoughts and feelings. Kale, however, remained steady throughout the discussion, addressing each concern with calm authority, reminding the council that the mate bond was recognized as sacred throughout every pack under his rule, and that questioning its legitimacy would only invite further instability rather than resolve it. He acknowledged the concerns about timing and Elena's unfamiliarity with court politics, but insisted that these were challenges to be managed, not reasons to dismiss the reality of what had occurred. As the meeting continued, Elena noticed one council member in particular who remained largely silent, observing the proceedings with a careful, calculating expression that made her uneasy for reasons she could not fully articulate. He was introduced eventually as General Bran, the commander of the King's Guard, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, offering to increase security around Elena given the potential risks now associated with her position, a suggestion Kale accepted immediately. The meeting stretched on for what felt like hours, covering logistics, security concerns, and the formal announcement that would need to be made to neighboring territories regarding the change in the king's status. Elena found herself increasingly overwhelmed by the sheer scope of considerations that came with a bond she had formed in a moment of desperate impulse, never imagining it would ripple outward into matters of regional politics and security. When the meeting finally concluded, the council members filed out one by one, some offering Elena polite but distant nods, others avoiding eye contact entirely. Corwin lingered near the doorway, exchanging a few final words with Kale, in a low voice that Elena could not quite hear, before he too departed, leaving Elena and Kale alone in the now quiet chamber. Kale rubbed a hand across his face, the first sign of genuine exhaustion Elena had seen from him since the events of the previous night. She asked him quietly whether meetings like this were a regular occurrence, and he gave a tired huff of something that might have been a laugh, telling her that unfortunately, they were becoming more frequent as tensions within the court continued to rise. She asked him about General Bran, curious about the careful way he had observed the proceedings without offering much input until the very end. Kale's expression grew thoughtful, and he told her that Bran had served his father for many years before serving him, and that while he trusted the general's loyalty to the throne itself, he could not yet rule out the possibility that Bran, or anyone else within the council, might be entangled in the conspiracy he suspected was working against him. The uncertainty in his voice unsettled Elena more than she expected. She had assumed, perhaps naively, that a king would surround himself with advisors he could trust completely, but the reality she was beginning to understand was far more complicated, a web of alliances and suspicions that made every interaction within the palace walls feel like a potential minefield. As the afternoon light began to shift toward evening, Kale suggested they walk through the gardens, away from the formal atmosphere of the council chamber, where they might speak more freely, without the weight of political scrutiny. Elena agreed, grateful for the chance to breathe air that did not feel thick with suspicion and calculation. The gardens were beautiful, filled with flowering plants Elena did not recognize, their fragrance mixing pleasantly with the cool evening breeze. As they walked, Kale began to open up more about the challenges he had faced since taking the throne, the weight of responsibility that had fallen on him far sooner than he had ever anticipated, and the isolation that came with a position where nearly everyone around him had some form of personal or political interest in his decisions. Elena listened carefully, finding herself drawn into his story despite the fear and uncertainty still lingering in her own mind. She realized, as they walked, that beneath the authority and composure he had shown throughout the day, there was a man who felt genuinely alone in his position, burdened by suspicions he could not fully confirm, and responsibilities he had never asked to inherit so young. She found herself sharing pieces of her own life in return, describing her years working in the kitchens, the friendships she had formed with the other workers, the quiet dreams she had once held of a simple life away from the political games that seemed to consume everyone around her. Kale listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking questions that revealed a curiosity about her life that felt sincere rather than merely polite. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden paths, Elena felt the tension of the day slowly beginning to ease, replaced by a cautious sense of connection with the man walking beside her. She still did not fully understand what her future held, or what dangers might lie ahead as she navigated this unfamiliar world of court politics and hidden conspiracies. But for the first time since the ceremony, she felt a flicker of hope that perhaps this unexpected path, chosen in a moment of desperate impulse, might lead somewhere she could learn to call home. Their quiet walk was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps on the garden path behind them, and both turned to see a guard approaching with visible urgency, his expression tight with concern. He informed Cale that a message had arrived from the northern border, reporting unusual activity among a rival pack that had long maintained an uneasy truce with the kingdom, and that the council required his immediate attention. Cale's relaxed demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by the sharp, focused authority Elena had witnessed during the council meeting. He apologized to Elena, though his mind had clearly already shifted toward the new crisis demanding his attention, and instructed the guard to escort her safely back to her chamber while he addressed the urgent matter. As she watched him stride away, his posture rigid with the weight of responsibility once again settling across his shoulders, Elena felt a fresh wave of unease wash over her. She had chosen to stay, to embrace this new and uncertain path, but the reality of what that choice truly meant was only beginning to reveal itself, layer by layer, each one more complicated and more dangerous than the last. The guard escorted her back through the darkening gardens, and as they walked, Elena could not shake the feeling that the quiet moment of connection she had shared with Cale only minutes before had been a brief respite before the true challenges of her new life began in earnest. Whatever threat loomed on the northern border, whatever conspiracy continued to unfold within the palace walls, she sensed that her role in these events was only just beginning, and that the choice she had made to stay would soon be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. Elena did not sleep well that night. She lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the shadows cast across the ceiling by the moonlight filtering through the tall windows, her mind turning over everything that had happened since the ceremony. The bond hummed steadily beneath her skin, a constant reminder of the choice she had made, and somewhere beyond the palace walls, she knew Cale was likely still awake, dealing with whatever crisis had emerged along the northern border. She rose before dawn, unable to remain still any longer, and dressed quietly, careful not to wake the small household staff who tended to her chamber. She wandered the quiet corridors, drawn toward a window that overlooked the courtyard where the ceremony had taken place only 2 nights before. It seemed impossible that so much had changed in such a short span of time. As she stood there, lost in thought, she heard footsteps approaching, and turned to find Wren walking briskly toward her, her expression carrying a mixture of concern and excitement that Elena had come to recognize as typical of the young attendant. Wren informed her that the king had returned from an urgent meeting only an hour before dawn, and that he had specifically requested Elena join him for a private conversation once she woke, given the seriousness of what had transpired overnight. Elena felt a fresh wave of anxiety settle in her stomach as she followed Wren through the palace, wondering what new complication awaited her. She found Cale in a small study she had not yet seen, surrounded by maps and documents, scattered across a large wooden desk, his expression drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes sharp with focused determination. He explained, as she took a seat across from him, that the unusual activity reported along the northern border had turned out to be a probing incursion by scouts from a neighboring territory, one that had maintained an uneasy peace with the kingdom for several years. While the incursion itself had been minor and easily repelled, what concerned him far more was the timing, occurring so soon after the very public formation of his bond with Elena, suggesting that whoever was behind the movement had been watching closely and had decided to test the kingdom's response during a moment of perceived vulnerability. Elena listened carefully, trying to understand the full scope of what he was describing. She asked whether he believed the incursion was connected to the conspiracy he suspected within his own court, and Cale admitted that he could not yet be certain, but that the possibility could not be ignored. If someone within his council was indeed working against him, it was not unreasonable to think they might have communicated with outside parties, seeking to create instability that could be exploited from multiple directions at once. The weight of the situation settled heavily on Elena's shoulders. She had known, in an abstract way, that stepping into this world would come with dangers, but hearing the details laid out so plainly made the reality far more immediate and frightening. She asked Cale what he intended to do next, and he explained that he planned to increase security along the border while simultaneously continuing his quiet investigation into the council, hoping to identify the source of the leaks before further damage could be done. He also told her, with a seriousness that made her stomach tighten further, that her own safety needed to be reconsidered given these developments. If enemies both within and outside the palace walls now viewed her as a target, whether to strike at him through her, or to eliminate her as a means of destabilizing the bond that protected his position, she would need to be more careful than she had initially anticipated. General Bran had already begun arranging additional guards to accompany her whenever she moved beyond the immediate palace grounds. Elena felt a flicker of frustration at the idea of being constantly watched and protected, a stark contrast to the independence she had grown accustomed to during her years working in the kitchens. But she also understood the necessity, especially given everything she had learned about the dangers surrounding the throne. She asked Kale whether there was anything she could do to actively help uncover the conspiracy, rather than simply waiting to be protected from threats she did not fully understand. Kale studied her for a long moment before answering, his expression thoughtful. He told her that her position within the palace, as someone new and largely unknown to the established political players, might actually give her certain advantages that he himself lacked. People often spoke more freely around those they did not view as significant threats, and her outsider status, combined with her low profile within the pack hierarchy before the bond formed, meant that certain council members and staff might reveal information to her that they would never share directly with the king. The idea unsettled Elena, the thought of essentially spying on the very people she now lived among, but she also recognized the logic in his suggestion. If she could help uncover the truth behind the conspiracy, she might be able to protect not only Kale but herself, and everyone else who might be caught in the crossfire of whatever plot was unfolding. She agreed, cautiously, to pay closer attention to conversations and interactions within the palace, to report anything unusual she noticed to Kale directly. He thanked her, his expression softening slightly, and told her that he did not take her willingness to help lightly, especially given how recently and unexpectedly she had been thrust into this dangerous world. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock, and Wren entered to inform them that breakfast had been prepared, and that several council members had requested a brief audience with Kale before the day's formal business began. Kale sighed, clearly wishing for more time to continue their conversation, but rose nonetheless, telling Elena that he would find her later in the day once his obligations allowed. Left alone in the study for a moment, Elena's eyes drifted over the maps scattered across the desk, noting the markings that indicated various pack territories and the tense borders between them. She traced a finger lightly along one line, trying to understand the geography of the tensions Kale now navigated, when Wren returned to escort her to a smaller dining area where breakfast awaited. As the day progressed, Elena found herself increasingly drawn into the rhythms of palace life, observing the various staff members and council attendants who moved through the halls with practiced efficiency. She paid careful attention to conversations she overheard, though most seemed mundane, focused on the logistics of daily palace operations, rather than anything resembling conspiracy or intrigue. It was during a quiet moment in the palace library, where she had wandered in search of distraction from her swirling thoughts, that she encountered a woman she had not yet met, seated at a table surrounded by scrolls and documents. The woman introduced herself as Mira, a scholar who served the council in matters of historical record and legal precedent, and her warm, unguarded manner immediately put Elena at ease, in a way few others within the palace had managed. Mira, it turned out, had been present at the ceremony and had witnessed the entire scene unfold, though unlike many others, she seemed genuinely curious about Elena's perspective rather than simply eager for gossip. They spoke for nearly an hour, Mira sharing stories about the history of the kingdom and the various mate bonds that had shaped its ruling lineage over generations, while Elena found herself relaxing into the conversation, grateful for a connection that felt entirely free of political calculation. As their conversation continued, Mira mentioned, almost in passing, that the circumstances surrounding the previous Alpha King's death had never fully satisfied her as a scholar of the kingdom's records. She explained that the official account described a hunting accident, but that certain details in the reports she had reviewed seemed inconsistent, timelines that did not quite align, witnesses whose accounts contradicted one another in small but noticeable ways. Elena's attention sharpened immediately, recalling Kale's own suspicions about his father's death. She asked Mira carefully whether she had ever shared these concerns with anyone else, and Mira's expression grew slightly more guarded, explaining that she had mentioned her observations to a few colleagues within the council years ago, but had been advised to let the matter rest, as reopening old wounds surrounding the previous king's death would serve no one, particularly during a time when the kingdom needed stability. Elena filed the information away carefully, recognizing its potential significance to Kale's ongoing investigation. She thanked Mira for the conversation, and promised to visit the library again soon, eager to continue learning about the kingdom's history from someone who seemed to genuinely value truth over political convenience. As she made her way back through the palace corridors, Elena's mind raced with the implications of what Mira had shared. If the previous king's death had indeed been more than a simple accident, and if certain council members had actively discouraged further investigation into the matter, it suggested that whoever was behind the conspiracy Kale suspected might have been working against the throne for far longer than anyone realized, potentially since before Kale had even taken power. She found Kale later that evening, finally free from his council obligations, and shared what Mira had told her, watching his expression grow increasingly intent as she spoke. He confirmed that he had long suspected foul play in his father's death, but had never had concrete evidence to support pursuing a formal investigation, especially given the political risks of accusing powerful council members without proof. He asked Elena if she would be willing to speak with Mira again, to learn more about the specific inconsistencies she had noticed, and which colleagues had advised her to abandon her concerns. Elena agreed, feeling a growing sense of purpose despite the underlying fear that continued to color her days within the palace. If she could help uncover the truth behind his father's death, she might also help identify the very conspiracy currently threatening Kale's own reign. Over the following days, Elena continued her careful observations throughout the palace, developing a growing network of small connections among the staff and lower-ranking council members who seemed to trust her more readily than they trusted the more established political figures. She learned, through careful and patient conversation, that Corwin had indeed been one of the colleagues who had advised Mira to abandon her concerns about the previous king's death, a detail that struck both her and Kale as significant, given Corwin's continued prominence within the current council. She also began noticing subtle patterns in the movement of certain resources and personnel that seemed inconsistent with the official explanations provided during council meetings, discrepancies that she carefully documented and shared with Kale during their increasingly frequent private conversations. Their evenings together, initially formal and cautious, gradually became a space where they could speak freely, sharing observations, theories, and the small personal details of their lives that helped them understand one another beyond the roles fate had thrust upon them. Despite the growing danger surrounding them, Elena found herself looking forward to these quiet evenings, appreciating the way Kale listened carefully to her observations, treating her insights with genuine respect, rather than dismissing them as the naive contributions of someone unfamiliar with court politics. She began to understand, more deeply with each passing day, why the mate bond had chosen to connect them, sensing beneath his careful, guarded exterior, a man who valued honesty and genuine connection, far more than the political games that consumed so much of his time. One evening, as they sat together in the garden where they had first shared a quiet walk, Elena asked Kale directly whether he believed Corwin was involved in the conspiracy against him. Kale's expression grew troubled, and he admitted that while the evidence remained circumstantial, his instincts increasingly pointed toward Corwin's involvement, though he cautioned that they needed concrete proof before making any accusations that could destabilize the council further if they proved incorrect. He told her that General Bran had begun quietly investigating financial records within the council's oversight, searching for any signs of resources being diverted toward purposes that did not align with their official designations. Elena offered to continue her own observations, particularly focused on any interactions between Corwin and outside parties who might be connected to the Northern Territory that had recently tested the kingdom's borders. As their conversation continued into the deepening evening, Elena found herself increasingly aware of how naturally their partnership had developed, transforming from the awkward, frightened uncertainty of their first meeting into something that felt genuinely collaborative, even as the danger surrounding them continued to grow. She realized, with a mixture of surprise and quiet contentment, that she no longer thought of her decision to stay as merely an acceptance of an unavoidable bond, but as a choice she was beginning to feel genuinely glad she had made. Their moment of quiet connection was interrupted, as it so often seemed to be, by the arrival of a guard bearing urgent news. This time, the message concerned a disturbance reported near the palace's outer perimeter, where guards had apprehended an intruder attempting to scale the walls under cover of darkness. Kale rose immediately, his relaxed demeanor once again replaced by sharp, focused authority, and instructed the guard to have the intruder brought to a secure holding chamber for questioning. Elena followed at a distance, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination, sensing that whatever this intruder revealed might provide the first concrete lead in their search for the truth behind the conspiracy threatening Kale's throne. As they approached the holding chamber, she caught sight of the intruder through a small window, a young man restrained by two guards, his expression a mixture of defiance and fear. Kale entered the chamber first, his presence immediately commanding the attention of everyone inside, while Elena remained just outside the doorway, watching carefully as the interrogation began. The young man initially refused to speak, his jaw clenched tight despite the guard's attempts to encourage cooperation, but as Kale's questioning continued, patient yet unrelenting, small pieces of information began to emerge. The intruder, it turned out, had been sent to gather information about palace security arrangements, particularly focused on identifying vulnerabilities that might be exploited during an upcoming event, though he claimed not to know the full details of what that event might entail. When Kale pressed further, asking who had sent him, the young man's eyes darted nervously toward the doorway where Elena stood, and for a brief, chilling moment, she felt certain he recognized her, though she had never seen him before in her life. The young man finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, that he had been instructed to report any information about the new mate bond and the woman connected to it, suggesting that whoever had sent him viewed Elena's presence within the palace as a matter of significant strategic importance. Kale's expression darkened considerably at this revelation, and he pressed further, demanding to know who had given these instructions, but the young man claimed he had received his orders through an intermediary, never meeting directly with whoever ultimately controlled the operation. As the interrogation continued, Elena felt a growing chill settle over her, the realization sinking in that she had become not merely a bystander, caught up in Kale's political troubles, but an active target of whatever conspiracy continued to unfold around them. The evening that had begun with quiet connection in the garden had transformed, once again, into a stark reminder of the dangers that now defined her life within the palace walls. Dangers that showed no sign of relenting, as the true scope of the plot against Kale's throne continued to reveal itself, piece by unsettling piece. Sleep did not come easily for Elena that night, the image of the young intruder's frightened eyes lingering in her mind long after the guards had led him away to a more secure holding cell. She kept turning over his words, the confirmation that whoever orchestrated the growing threat against Kale viewed her presence as something worth actively monitoring, something significant enough to warrant the risk of sending someone to scale the palace walls under cover of darkness. She rose early again the next morning, finding Kale already awake in his study, the same maps and documents from days before, now supplemented with new notes scrawled in his careful handwriting. He looked up as she entered, his expression tired but alert, and gestured for her to sit as he continued reviewing a report General Bran had apparently delivered overnight. He explained that Bran's investigation into the financial records had uncovered several irregularities, resources allocated toward supposed border reinforcement projects that, upon closer inspection, seemed to lead nowhere, funds disappearing into accounts that could not be easily traced back to any legitimate purpose. While the evidence remained circumstantial, the pattern strongly suggested that someone within the council had been diverting kingdom resources for purposes they wished to keep hidden. Elena asked whether the intruder captured the previous night had revealed anything further during subsequent questioning, and Kale shook his head, explaining that the young man genuinely seemed to know little beyond his immediate instructions, a common tactic among those orchestrating conspiracies, ensuring that even if lower-level operatives were captured, they could not reveal the identity of those truly in control. Despite the frustration evident in his voice, Kale seemed determined rather than discouraged, and he told Elena that they needed to accelerate their efforts to identify Corwin's potential involvement, given the mounting circumstantial evidence pointing in his direction. He suggested that Elena continue cultivating her relationship with Mira, hoping the scholar might uncover additional historical details that could help establish a clearer pattern of Corwin's activities over the years. Elena agreed, though she found herself increasingly uneasy about the idea of essentially using her budding friendship with Mira as a means of gathering intelligence, even if the ultimate goal was to protect Kale and the kingdom from genuine danger. She resolved to be as honest as possible with Mira about the situation, trusting that the scholar's evident concern for truth and historical accuracy might mean she would be willing to help once she understood the full stakes involved. Over the following week, Elena found herself falling into a careful rhythm, spending her mornings in quiet conversation with Kale, reviewing whatever new information had emerged overnight, and her afternoons in the library with Mira, gradually building a clearer picture of the inconsistencies surrounding the previous king's death and the various council decisions that seemed to align suspiciously well with Corwin's apparent interests. Mira, once Elena explained the broader context of the danger facing Kale and the kingdom, proved to be an enthusiastic and thorough collaborator, her scholarly instincts driving her to dig deeper into the palace's historical records than she had ever felt comfortable doing before. She discovered documentation of several land disputes that had been resolved in ways that seemed to disproportionately benefit territories with known connections to Corwin's extended family. Decisions that had been justified through legal precedents Mira now suspected had been selectively interpreted or even fabricated. As their investigation progressed, Elena also noticed a growing tension developing between herself and certain members of the council, who seemed increasingly wary of her presence within the palace, their polite greetings carrying an undertone of suspicion that had not been present during her first days after the ceremony. She mentioned this observation to Kale during one of their evening conversations, and he confirmed that word of the intruder's capture, and the revelation that Elena herself had become a target had spread quietly among the council, leading some members to grow increasingly cautious in her presence, uncertain whether she might be somehow connected to the very threats they now feared. The isolation this created weighed on Elena more than she had expected, and she found herself grateful for the quiet evenings with Kale, the moments in the garden or the study, where the careful political calculations of daily palace life could be set aside, even briefly, in favor of genuine conversation and connection. She began to notice, too, the way Kale seemed to relax more fully in her presence than she had witnessed with anyone else within the palace, a small but meaningful sign that their bond had grown into something deeper than the simple obligation fate had initially thrust upon them. One evening, as autumn winds began to sweep through the garden, scattering fallen leaves across the stone pathways, Kale shared with Elena a memory of his father, describing a man who had ruled with fairness and genuine care for his people, qualities Kale had tried to emulate since taking the throne, despite the immense pressure and isolation that came with the position. He spoke of the grief he had never fully processed, the suspicious circumstances of his father's death, compounding the loss with an unresolved sense of injustice that had haunted him for years. Elena listened with genuine empathy, understanding on some level the weight of carrying unresolved grief, while still needing to function within a world that demanded constant strength and decisiveness. She shared, in turn, memories of her own mother, who had died when Elena was still young, leaving her to navigate the pack's hierarchy largely on her own, developing the careful, watchful nature that had ultimately led her to the desperate plan that had brought her to this unexpected life within the palace. Their shared vulnerability in these quiet moments deepened the connection between them, and Elena found herself increasingly aware of a warmth that extended beyond the physical hum of the mate bond, a genuine affection that had grown from mutual respect and understanding, rather than simply the fate that had bound them together. She began to wonder, with a mixture of hope and lingering fear, whether the life she had never expected to want might actually become one she could genuinely embrace. This growing closeness did not go unnoticed within the palace, and Elena began to sense a subtle shift in how certain staff members and council attendants treated her, a gradual thawing of the initial suspicion and skepticism that had greeted her arrival. Even some of the more cautious council members began offering slightly warmer greetings, though the underlying political tensions surrounding Kale's throne remained as pronounced as ever. It was during this period of cautious optimism that Elena received an unexpected visitor, a young woman from her original pack who had traveled to the palace requesting an audience, claiming to bear an urgent message. Elena recognized her immediately as Fenna, a friend from her days working in the kitchens, and felt a surge of genuine happiness at seeing a familiar, friendly face amid the constant political calculations that now dominated her days. Their reunion, however, quickly turned somber as Fenna explained the reason for her visit. Draven, apparently unable to accept the loss of his intended claim on Elena, had grown increasingly erratic in the weeks following the ceremony, his behavior toward other pack members becoming more volatile and threatening. Fenna reported that he had begun making veiled threats against anyone who spoke favorably of Elena or her new position, and that several pack members feared he might be planning something more drastic, though nobody knew exactly what. Elena felt a chill settle over her as she listened to Fenna's account, remembering the venomous threat Draven had whispered, before disappearing into the crowd on the night of the ceremony. She thanked Fenna for the warning, and promised to relay the information to Kale immediately, while also arranging for Fenna to remain safely within the palace for a few days, rather than risk traveling back through territory, where Draven's growing instability might pose a danger to her as well. When Elena shared Fenna's report with Kale that evening, his expression grew grim, and he acknowledged that Draven's continued presence as a threat, separate from but potentially connected to the broader conspiracy they were investigating, needed to be addressed more directly. He explained that while he had hoped Draven's public humiliation at the ceremony might discourage further aggression, it seemed clear now that the opposite had occurred, his wounded pride apparently festering into something far more dangerous. Kale instructed General Brand to increase monitoring of Draven's activities within the Packlands, hoping to gather enough evidence of genuine threats to justify formal action before the situation escalated further. Elena, meanwhile, continued her careful investigation alongside Mira, though the growing list of threats surrounding her, from Draven's simmering resentment to the mysterious forces behind the intruder's capture, made every day within the palace feel increasingly precarious. Despite the mounting dangers, Elena found herself unwilling to retreat from the path she had chosen, drawing strength from the growing bond she shared with Kale, and the sense of purpose she had discovered in helping uncover the truth behind the conspiracy threatening the kingdom's stability. She spent long hours reviewing historical records with Mira, cross-referencing council decisions with land disputes and resource allocations, gradually building a case that increasingly pointed toward Corwin's central involvement in whatever scheme continued to unfold. One afternoon, as she and Mira pored over a particularly dense set of records detailing council votes from several years prior, Mira made a discovery that sent a jolt of excitement through both of them. Buried within the records was a reference to a private meeting held shortly before the previous king's fatal hunting accident, a meeting attended by Corwin and several individuals whose names Mira did not immediately recognize, but whose titles suggested connections to territories beyond the kingdom's traditional borders, including the very northern territory that had recently tested Kale's defenses. Elena felt her pulse quicken as she read through the sparse details of the meeting's minutes, which offered no explanation for its purpose, but noted that it had taken place just 3 days before the king's death. She and Mira exchanged a knowing glance, both recognizing the significance of what they had uncovered, and Elena immediately gathered the documents to share with Kale, eager to present this potential breakthrough in their investigation. Kale's reaction upon reviewing the documents was a mixture of vindication and renewed anger, the evidence finally providing concrete support for suspicions he had carried for years without proof. He immediately called for General Bran, instructing him to quietly investigate the identities of the other individuals present at the meeting, hoping to establish clearer connections between Corwin and the outside forces that might be orchestrating the current threats against the throne. As the investigation gained momentum, Elena felt a growing sense of hope that they might finally be closing in on the truth, though she remained acutely aware that Corwin, if indeed guilty, would not simply allow his schemes to be uncovered without a fight. The tension within the palace continued to build, each new piece of evidence bringing them closer to a confrontation that Elena sensed was rapidly approaching, one that would likely determine not only the fate of Kale's throne, but potentially her own safety as well. That evening, as she prepared to retire for the night, Elena received a message from Ren, informing her that Kale wished to speak with her regarding an urgent matter that had arisen following General Brand's initial inquiries into the identities from the meeting records. Elena's heart raced as she made her way to Kale's study, sensing that whatever news awaited her would likely mark a significant turning point in their ongoing investigation, one that would bring them closer to finally confronting the true source of the danger that had shadowed her every step since the night she had knelt before a stranger at the mating ceremony. Kale's study was lit only by a single lamp when Elena arrived, the flickering flame casting long shadows across the walls as he stood over his desk, studying a fresh report that General Bran had delivered only an hour before. He looked up as she entered, his expression grave, and gestured for her to close the door behind her before he began to speak. He explained that Bran had managed to identify two of the individuals present at the mysterious meeting, recorded in the historical documents Elena and Mira had uncovered. Both men, it turned out, held positions of influence within the Northern Territory that had recently tested the kingdom's border defenses, and one of them, according to Bran's sources, had traveled to the palace region only days before the mating ceremony under a false identity, ostensibly to conduct trade negotiations that seemed to lack any legitimate paperwork or follow-up. Elena felt a chill settle over her as she absorbed this information, the pieces of the conspiracy slowly forming a clearer, more disturbing picture. If Corwin had indeed been coordinating with forces from the Northern Territory for years, potentially even orchestrating the previous king's death to place a more easily influenced ruler on the throne, then the recent probing incursion along the border, along with the intruders sent to gather information about Elena, suggested a coordinated effort that had been building towards some larger, more decisive action. Kale confirmed her fears, explaining that Bran's investigation suggested the conspiracy extended far beyond simple political maneuvering, pointing instead toward a planned effort to destabilize the kingdom from within, weakening Kale's authority and support among the council, while simultaneously testing the kingdom's external defenses, likely in preparation for a more direct challenge to his rule. The timing of the recent events, from the ceremony to the border incursion to the captured intruder, now appeared far less coincidental than they had initially seemed. Elena asked what their next steps should be, and Kale explained that he intended to confront Corwin directly, though he wanted to gather additional evidence first, to ensure the confrontation could not be easily dismissed or deflected. He planned to have Bran continue monitoring Corwin's communications and movements discreetly, while also reaching out to trusted allies among the neighboring territories to gauge whether similar conspiracies might be unfolding elsewhere within the region. As their conversation continued late into the night, a guard interrupted them with urgent news that immediately shifted the atmosphere in the room from cautious strategy to genuine alarm. The guard reported that a fire had broken out in the eastern wing of the palace, an area that housed several storage rooms containing important historical and financial records, including many of the documents Elena and Mira had been reviewing over the past weeks. Kale and Elena rushed toward the eastern wing alongside the guard, finding the corridor filled with smoke and several members of the palace staff working frantically to contain the blaze before it could spread further. Elena's heart sank as she realized the fire had started precisely in the section where the historical records connecting Corwin to the mysterious meeting had been stored, a coincidence far too convenient to be accidental. The fire was eventually brought under control, though not before significant damage had been done to several storage rooms, destroying countless documents that might have provided crucial additional evidence. As dawn broke over the palace, revealing the smoke-damaged corridor and the exhausted faces of those who had fought through the night to contain the blaze, Kale's expression hardened with a cold, determined fury that Elena had not seen from him before. He confirmed, once the immediate danger had passed, that the fire had almost certainly been set deliberately, an act of desperation from someone who recognized that the investigation into the previous king's death was drawing dangerously close to uncovering the truth. This realization, rather than discouraging their efforts, seemed to strengthen Kale's resolve, confirming that they were indeed on the right path, and that whoever orchestrated the conspiracy felt genuinely threatened by their progress. Elena, exhausted from the night's events but equally resolute, suggested that they needed to accelerate their timeline, moving toward a confrontation with Corwin before he had the opportunity to destroy additional evidence or take more drastic action to protect himself and his co-conspirators. Kale agreed, though he cautioned that they needed to proceed carefully, ensuring that when they finally confronted Corwin, they would have enough support and evidence to prevent him from simply denying everything and rallying sympathetic council members to his defense. Over the following days, the palace existed in a state of heightened tension, the fire serving as an unmistakable signal that the conspiracy against Kale's throne had moved beyond quiet political maneuvering into active, dangerous sabotage. General Bran increased security throughout the palace grounds, while Kale worked carefully behind the scenes to identify which council members remained genuinely loyal to the throne and which might be sympathetic to or complicit in Corwin's schemes. Elena continued working alongside Mira, though their investigation now focused on reconstructing what information had been lost in the fire, relying on Mira's exceptional memory of the documents she had reviewed, and cross-referencing her recollections with whatever records had survived the blaze. Their efforts, though slower than before, continued to yield small but significant pieces of evidence, gradually rebuilding the case against Corwin, despite his apparent attempt to destroy it. During this tense period, Elena also received troubling news regarding Draven, whose behavior back within her original pack had continued to deteriorate, according to further reports from Fenna, who had remained within the palace grounds at Elena's insistence, given the growing dangers within the packlands. Fenna reported that Draven had begun associating with individuals from outside the pack, strangers whose presence had raised concern among the pack elders, though nobody had yet identified their purpose or origin. Elena shared this information with Kale, and together they began to wonder whether Draven's wounded pride and growing instability had made him vulnerable to manipulation by the same forces behind the broader conspiracy, potentially transforming him from a simple personal threat into another pawn within Corwin's larger scheme. Kale instructed Bran to extend his investigation to include monitoring Draven's new associations, hoping to determine whether a connection existed between the pack's internal turmoil and the conspiracy unfolding within the palace. As the investigation continued to expand, Elena found herself increasingly exhausted, the constant vigilance required to navigate palace politics while simultaneously conducting a covert investigation, taking a visible toll on her. Kale, noticing her fatigue during one of their evening conversations, expressed genuine concern, urging her to take time for herself, despite the mounting pressures surrounding them both. Elena appreciated his concern, though she insisted that she preferred to remain actively involved in uncovering the truth, rather than retreating into passive safety while others faced the danger on her behalf. Their conversation that evening turned toward more personal matters, a welcome respite from the constant strategizing that had dominated their recent interactions. Kale spoke more openly than he had before about his hopes for the kingdom's future, his desire to rule with the same fairness and genuine care his father had embodied, despite the current turmoil threatening to undermine everything he had worked to build since taking the throne. Elena found herself moved by his sincerity, recognizing in his words a man who genuinely cared about his people's well-being, rather than simply clinging to power for its own sake. She shared, in turn, her own growing sense of belonging within the palace, despite the dangers and challenges she had faced since the ceremony. She admitted that she had never expected to find purpose or connection within this unexpected life, having originally viewed her bond to Kale as simply an unfortunate consequence of her desperate attempt to escape Draven's claim. But now, weeks into their shared journey, she recognized that the bond had led her toward something far more meaningful than she could have anticipated, a genuine partnership built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and a connection that continued to deepen with each passing day. Their conversation was interrupted, as had become almost routine, by an urgent message, this time regarding a breakthrough in Bran's investigation into Draven's new associations. The guard reported that Bran had identified one of the strangers spending time with Draven as a known agent connected to the Northern Territory, confirming the suspected link between the pack's internal turmoil and the broader conspiracy threatening the kingdom. Kale's expression grew resolute as he absorbed this information, recognizing that the various threads of the conspiracy were finally converging into a clearer picture. He instructed the guard to have Bran continue monitoring the situation closely, while also beginning preparations for a formal confrontation with Corwin, now confident that they possessed sufficient evidence to proceed despite the setback caused by the fire. As the guard departed, Kale turned to Elena, his expression carrying a mixture of determination and genuine concern for her safety, given the escalating danger surrounding their investigation. He told her that the coming days would likely bring the confrontation they had been building toward, and that she needed to be prepared for whatever consequences might follow, including the possibility that Corwin and his allies might attempt something drastic once they realized their schemes were unraveling. Elena nodded, steadying herself against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her, drawing strength instead from the resolve she had developed over the past weeks, and from the genuine partnership she had built with Kale, despite the unconventional circumstances that had brought them together. Whatever confrontation awaited them, She was determined to face it not as a passive bystander, caught up in dangers beyond her control, but as an active participant in protecting the kingdom and the man whose fate had become so deeply intertwined with her own. That night, as she finally returned to her chamber to rest, Elena found herself reflecting on how dramatically her life had transformed since the night of the ceremony. The desperate, frightened woman who had knelt before a stranger in a last, impulsive bid for freedom had become someone entirely different, someone who had found unexpected purpose, connection, and even a growing sense of courage in the face of genuine danger. Whatever challenges awaited in the days ahead, she felt ready to meet them, no longer merely surviving within this unexpected life, but genuinely choosing to fight for it. The next few days passed in a blur of careful preparation, as Kale and General Bran worked to identify which council members and guards could be trusted absolutely, before moving forward with any confrontation against Corwin. Elena spent her time split between quiet strategy sessions with Kale and continued research alongside Mira, piecing together the final threads of evidence that would be needed to expose the conspiracy beyond any reasonable doubt. It was during one of these strategy sessions that Bran arrived with news that shifted their careful timeline entirely. He reported that Corwin had requested an unusual meeting with several council members scheduled for that very evening, a gathering held under the pretense of discussing routine border security matters, but taking place at an old ceremonial ground on the outskirts of the palace grounds, rather than the customary council chamber, a location choice that immediately raised suspicion, given its isolation and distance from the palace's usual security presence. Kale's expression grew sharp with recognition, suspecting that Corwin, sensing the net closing around him, intended to use this meeting to either consolidate support among sympathetic council members or to finalize plans with his outside allies before the conspiracy could be fully exposed. He decided, after a tense discussion with Bran, that they needed to intervene directly, using the element of surprise to catch Corwin and any co-conspirators before they could execute whatever plan they had been developing. Elena insisted on accompanying them, despite Kale's initial reluctance to expose her to further danger. She argued that her knowledge of the historical records and the pattern of evidence they had uncovered might prove crucial if immediate confrontation and questioning became necessary, and that she had already proven herself capable of handling the pressures and dangers that came with her position within the palace. Kale, recognizing the truth in her words and unwilling to leave her unprotected within the palace while facing an uncertain security situation, reluctantly agreed, on the condition that she remain close to him and follow Bran's guidance regarding safety at all times. As evening approached, Kale, Elena, Bran, and a small contingent of trusted guards made their way quietly toward the old ceremonial grounds, moving through less traveled paths to avoid drawing attention to their approach. The grounds themselves, Elena noted as they drew closer, held an eerie, abandoned quality, the ancient stone structures weathered by years of disuse, a stark contrast to the vibrant, torchlit courtyard where the mating ceremony had taken place weeks before. They positioned themselves at a discreet distance from the gathering point, watching as Corwin arrived along with 3 other council members whose loyalties had remained uncertain throughout the investigation. Elena recognized 2 of them from previous council meetings, though she had never suspected their potential involvement in the conspiracy until this moment. The 4th figure, wrapped in a dark cloak that obscured most of his features, remained unfamiliar to her entirely, though something about his posture and the way the others deferred to him suggested he held significant influence within whatever scheme was unfolding. As the group settled into their meeting, speaking in low voices that Bran's men, positioned strategically closer to the gathering, worked to capture, Kale signaled for patience, wanting to gather as much information as possible before revealing their presence. Elena watched tensely, her heart pounding as she strained to catch fragments of the conversation carried faintly on the evening breeze. The cloaked stranger, it became clear through the overheard fragments, represented interests from the Northern Territory, confirming the connection Bran had already suspected. He spoke of resources being prepared for a more direct action against the kingdom, timed to coincide with growing instability that Corwin and his allies within the council would help engineer from within. Elena felt a chill run through her as she realized the scope of what they were witnessing, a plan far more extensive and dangerous than she had initially imagined, one that threatened not just Kale's throne, but the stability and safety of the entire kingdom. As the conversation continued, Corwin's voice grew clearer, and Elena heard him explicitly reference his role in the previous king's death, confirming years of suspicion, with a chilling matter-of-fact tone that spoke to how thoroughly he had convinced himself of the necessity and justification for his actions. He spoke of Cale as an obstacle who had proven more resistant to manipulation than his father had been, and mentioned Elena directly, describing the unexpected bond as an unfortunate complication that had strengthened Cale's position and required more aggressive action to overcome. Cale's jaw tightened at these words, his hand instinctively moving toward Elena's, a silent acknowledgement of the danger they now faced together. Bran, sensing that they had gathered sufficient evidence and that further delay risked the conspirators finalizing dangerous plans, gave the signal for their group to move forward and confront the gathering directly. What followed happened quickly, guards moving in coordinated formation to surround the ceremonial grounds, while Cale stepped forward into the torchlight, his presence immediately silencing the startled conspirators. Corwin's face went pale as he recognized the trap that had been sprung, his eyes darting toward the cloaked stranger, as if seeking guidance. But the stranger, recognizing the situation, had turned against them, moved swiftly toward the shadows at the edge of the ceremonial grounds, attempting to escape before Bran's guards could apprehend him. Elena, positioned near Cale as the confrontation unfolded, noticed the stranger's escape attempt and, acting on instinct rather than careful calculation, shouted a warning to the nearest guard, drawing attention to his movement before he could disappear entirely into the darkness. Her quick action allowed the guard to intercept him, tackling him to the ground just as he reached the edge of the clearing, his hood falling back to reveal a face Elena did not recognize, though his features carried an unmistakable resemblance to the ruling family of the Northern Territory that had long maintained an uneasy relationship with Cale's kingdom. With the stranger captured and the remaining council members, including Corwin, surrounded by Bran's guards, the confrontation reached its tense climax. Corwin, recognizing the futility of denial given what had already been overheard, attempted instead to justify his actions, claiming that Cale's rule had grown weak and vulnerable, that the kingdom needed stronger leadership than what he believed Cale could provide, and that his actions, however extreme, had been motivated by genuine concern for the kingdom's stability and future. Cale listened to Corwin's justifications with a controlled fury that Elena had never witnessed from him before, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge as he responded, reminding Corwin that his father had trusted him completely, that the kingdom he claimed to protect had been thrown into genuine danger by his betrayal, and that whatever justifications he offered could not excuse the death of a king who had shown him nothing but loyalty and respect throughout his years of service. The other council members present at the meeting, seeing the overwhelming evidence and the futility of resistance, quickly began offering their own confessions, revealing details about the extent of Corwin's manipulation and the various ways he had used his position to advance the conspiracy over the years. Their cooperation, while not excusing their involvement, provided Cale and Bran with crucial additional information about the full scope of the plot and the identities of other individuals, both within the kingdom and beyond its borders, who had been complicit in the scheme. As the guards began escorting the captured conspirators back toward the palace for formal questioning and judgment, Elena found herself standing beside Cale amid the now quiet ceremonial grounds, the adrenaline of the confrontation slowly beginning to fade, replaced by a profound sense of relief, mixed with lingering shock at how close they had come to a far more dangerous outcome had they not acted when they did. Cale turned to her, his expression softening from the hardened authority he had displayed during the confrontation into something more personal, more grateful. He thanked her for her quick thinking, acknowledging that her warning had prevented the cloaked stranger, who Bran's initial questioning suggested held significant knowledge of the Northern Territory's broader plans, from escaping and potentially continuing the conspiracy from elsewhere. Elena, still processing the intensity of what had just occurred, simply nodded, grateful that her instinctive reaction had proven helpful rather than reckless. As they made their way back toward the palace, walking side by side through the darkened grounds now quiet after the tension of the confrontation, Elena felt the weight of everything they had endured over the past weeks, finally beginning to settle into a sense of cautious triumph. The conspiracy that had shadowed Cale's reign since before he had even taken the throne had finally been exposed, its key architects captured, And while she suspected that fully dismantling the broader network of allies within the Northern Territory would require continued effort and vigilance, the immediate threat to Kael's throne and to her own safety had been significantly diminished. Kael reached for her hand as they walked, his fingers intertwining with hers, in a gesture that felt entirely natural, despite the formality that had once characterized their early interactions. Elena felt the familiar warmth of the bond pulse gently beneath her skin, no longer simply a reminder of fate's unexpected intervention, but a genuine comfort, a physical manifestation of the connection they had built together through weeks of shared danger, careful investigation, and growing mutual trust. As they approached the palace gates, the torchlight illuminating the familiar courtyard where their story had begun in such unexpected fashion, Elena reflected on how far she had come since that desperate night when she had knelt before a disguised stranger, hoping only to escape a fate she found unbearable. She had never imagined that her impulsive decision would lead her toward genuine partnership, toward uncovering a conspiracy that threatened an entire kingdom, and toward a connection with a man whose strength and integrity she had come to genuinely admire, and, she realized with quiet clarity, to love. Whatever challenges remained ahead, the continued dismantling of the broader conspiracy, the formal judgment that would need to be rendered against Corwin and his fellow conspirators, and the ongoing work of stabilizing the kingdom's relationship with the Northern Territory. Elena felt ready to face them, no longer as a frightened woman, caught in circumstances beyond her control, but as someone who had actively chosen to fight for the life and the connection she had found within this unexpected path. Fate, and her own desperate courage, had set her upon. In the days that followed the confrontation at the ceremonial grounds, the palace settled into a new rhythm, one defined by the careful, methodical work of formal judgment and the gradual restoration of trust among the council members who remained. Corwin's formal hearing took place before the full council, and Elena, along with Mira, was called to present the historical evidence they had gathered, the documentation that had first revealed the suspicious meeting preceding the previous king's death, now serving as crucial testimony in establishing the full extent of his betrayal. Corwin, faced with the overwhelming evidence and the corroborating testimony of the other captured council members, offered little further resistance during the hearing, his earlier justifications giving way to a resigned acknowledgement of his actions. Kael, presiding over the judgment with the same fairness his father had been known for, delivered a verdict that stripped Corwin of his position and title, sentencing him to permanent exile from the kingdom's territories, a punishment that, while severe, reflected Kael's belief in justice, tempered by the restraint his father had always emphasized, rather than the harsher penalties some council members had initially demanded. The other conspirators within the council faced similarly serious consequences, though those who had cooperated fully with the investigation received somewhat more lenient judgments, reflecting the value of their assistance in fully exposing the conspiracy's scope. The cloaked stranger from the Northern Territory, whose identity was eventually confirmed as a lesser member of that territory's ruling family, became a crucial diplomatic issue, with Kael carefully navigating negotiations to ensure the broader conspiracy could be addressed without triggering open conflict between the two territories, a delicate balance that required weeks of careful diplomacy following the initial confrontation. As the immediate crisis began to resolve, Elena found herself increasingly settling into her role within the palace, no longer viewed with the wary suspicion that had greeted her arrival, but instead with a growing respect that had been earned through her active role in uncovering and helping resolve the conspiracy that had threatened the kingdom's stability. Council members who had once avoided direct interaction with her now sought her counsel on various matters, recognizing the sharp intelligence and genuine dedication she had demonstrated throughout the crisis. Her relationship with Kael, too, continued to deepen during this period, the shared trials they had endured together, forging a bond that extended far beyond the simple fate that had initially connected them. Their quiet evenings in the garden became a cherished routine, moments where they could set aside the formal responsibilities of their positions and simply enjoy one another's company, sharing stories, dreams, and the small, comfortable silences that spoke to a genuine partnership built on mutual understanding and respect. One evening, several weeks after Corwin's formal judgment had been rendered, Kael invited Elena to join him for a walk through the palace grounds, leading her toward the very courtyard where the mating ceremony had taken place months before. The space had been transformed since that fateful night, decorated now with soft lanterns and flowering vines that climbed the ancient stone structures, a stark contrast to the tense, torchlit atmosphere of the ceremony where their story had begun. Elena looked around, taking in the transformation with quiet wonder, and turned to Cale with a question in her eyes. He explained, his expression carrying a rare vulnerability that reminded her of their earliest conversations, that he had asked the palace staff to prepare the courtyard for a formal bonding ceremony, one that would publicly and officially celebrate their connection, not as the accidental consequence of her desperate plan to avoid an unwanted claim, but as a deliberate, joyful choice made freely by both of them. He told her that he wanted the kingdom to witness not merely the fated bond that had brought them together, but the genuine partnership and affection that had grown between them since that first chaotic night. He asked her, with a sincerity that made her chest tighten with emotion, whether she would be willing to stand beside him in this new ceremony, choosing him and the life they had built together, this time with full understanding and genuine desire rather than desperate necessity. Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes as she absorbed the weight of his question, thinking back to the frightened, desperate woman who had knelt before a stranger months before, hoping only to escape a fate she found unbearable, never imagining that impulsive decision would lead her to this moment, standing in the same courtyard, being asked by the same man to choose him freely and completely. She answered without hesitation, telling him that she wanted nothing more than to stand beside him, not because fate had bound them together, but because she had come to genuinely love him, admiring not just his strength and authority as a king, but his integrity, his honesty, and the quiet vulnerability he had shown her throughout their journey together. The formal bonding ceremony took place 2 weeks later, the courtyard filled once again with pack members and dignitaries from across the kingdom, though the atmosphere carried none of the tension and uncertainty that had characterized the mating ceremony months before. Elena stood at the center of the courtyard, dressed in fine fabrics that spoke of her new position, yet still carrying the same quiet strength and determination that had defined her since her days working in the kitchens. Cale stood beside her, dressed not in the ragged disguise he had worn when they first met, but in the formal attire befitting his true position, though Elena noticed, with quiet affection, that he still carried himself with the same understated humility that had first drawn her curiosity when she had mistaken him for a simple wanderer. As the elders began the formal bonding words, Elena felt none of the desperate fear that had gripped her during the mating ceremony, replaced instead by a profound sense of peace and genuine joy at the life she had chosen. Mira stood among the crowd, her expression carrying evident pride at the role she had played in helping uncover the truth that had ultimately strengthened, rather than undermined, the bond between Elena and Cale. General Brand, too, watched with quiet approval, his earlier caution toward Elena long since replaced by genuine respect for the courage and intelligence she had demonstrated throughout the crisis. Even Fenna, who had remained within the palace following the resolution of the conspiracy, watched with tears of happiness, grateful to see her friend find genuine joy and purpose in a life so different from the one they had once shared in the pack's kitchens. As the ceremony concluded, and Cale and Elena shared a kiss before the assembled crowd, one that carried none of the desperate uncertainty of their first, accidental kiss, but instead, a genuine, joyful affirmation of the love they had built together, the courtyard erupted into celebration. Elena felt the familiar warmth of the bond pulse through her, no longer simply a reminder of fate's intervention, but a genuine, comforting presence that would remain with her for the rest of her life. In the weeks that followed, Elena settled fully into her role as Alpha Queen, working alongside Cale to rebuild trust within the council and strengthen the kingdom's relationships with neighboring territories, including careful, ongoing diplomacy with the Northern Territory to ensure that the conspiracy that had once threatened the kingdom would never again find fertile ground to take root. She continued her work with Mira, establishing a more thorough system for preserving and reviewing the kingdom's historical records, ensuring that future generations would have access to accurate accounts that could help prevent similar conspiracies from developing unnoticed. Draven, she learned through occasional updates from Fenna, had eventually been removed from his position within the pack, following clear evidence of his involvement with agents from the Northern Territory, a consequence of the instability and vulnerability created by his wounded pride and desperate need for validation. Elena felt no satisfaction in his downfall, only a quiet relief that the threat he had once posed to her safety and autonomy had been fully and permanently resolved. As the seasons changed and the kingdom settled into a period of renewed stability and growth, Elena often found herself reflecting on the unlikely path that had brought her to this life, one that had begun with a desperate, impulsive decision made in a moment of genuine fear, and had transformed, through courage, partnership, and genuine love, into a life she could never have imagined for herself, yet one she now embraced completely. She thought, sometimes, of the ragged stranger she had first noticed sitting alone in the courtyard, dismissed by everyone around him as nothing more than a beggar, and marveled at how completely her understanding of him, and of herself, had changed since that fateful night. The woman who had knelt before him, hoping only to escape one unwanted fate, had found instead a life defined not by fear and desperation, but by genuine connection, purpose, and a love that had grown stronger through every trial they had faced together. As she stood beside Kale one evening, watching the sunset paint the palace gardens in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Elena felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected turn her life had taken. Whatever challenges the future might bring, she knew now that she would face them not alone, but alongside a partner whose strength, integrity, and genuine love had transformed her life in ways she could never have anticipated when she made that desperate, impulsive choice at the mating ceremony so many months before. The kingdom, once threatened by hidden conspiracy and simmering danger, had found renewed stability under their joint leadership, a testament to the strength that could emerge when genuine partnership, courage, and love were allowed to flourish, even when born from the most unexpected and chaotic of beginnings. And as Elena looked toward the future, she felt nothing but hope for the life and the love she had found, a life that had begun with a kiss, meant to escape one fate, only to lead her toward a far greater one she could never have imagined, yet one she would choose again and again, without hesitation, for the rest of her days.